Welcome to Coffee and Divination, a podcast about the arts of obtaining hidden knowledge in changing times. Join me, Joanna Farrar, to chat with experts from around the world on tarot, runes, geomancy, and the many ways divination can help us navigate and plan our paths ahead. So thank you all very much for joining. Thank you for everyone who's here live, and thank you for everyone who is listening afterwards in the recording. I'm very excited to have Brian Wilkins on as our next guest on Coffee and Divination. Brian and I have met a few times in a few different contexts and worked together a couple of times, and he is just wonderful, and I'm really excited for this conversation. Brian is a respected poet, an author, a diviner, definitely a magician and cunning man, and a Taiji teacher. And he is based in Poughkeepsie, New York, and I think this is going to be a really fantastic chat. So thank you, Brian, for being here.
Oh, thank you, Joanna, for having me on. It's going to be, I'm looking forward to it a lot. I was also very charmed that you decided to add respected to anything I do, which makes me excited. It sounds like I should live up to it, so I'll do my best.
Well, that's what this, the interview.
I feel like I've been conferred. You've conferred respect upon me, so...
Well, speaking of respect, my first question to you is, how did you become involved in divination? Like, what were your first experiences with divination? Was it something that was around you as a child with like a great aunt reading tea leaves, or just something you picked up much later in life?
So it's strange. So my background is... Baptist. My folks I grew up in a traditional Baptist household. I like to tell people it was the Jimmy Carter, not Jerry Falwell variety, but all the same, the idea of magic and things was not exactly something that was done on a regular basis. However, dream interpretation was a constant feature of my childhood. So every morning we would tell our dreams and we would interpret them, and we would interpret them with an eye to what ancestors may have spoken to us, what we may be looking forward to, like what might be predicted by the dream, and what might be brought out sort of psychologically as well. So it's one of those cases where I grew up in a household that very staunchly said it did no magic and constantly was doing magic all the time. My first real experience with divination, though, was actually in Bosnia. I went there after my freshman year of college to teach English to some refugee kids. And we stayed with families that were there. And I think actually Camellia Elias talked about in Eastern Europe, the idea of coffee grounds being read at like every time there's coffee was definitely a part of what was going on there. But what I count as my first experience of that was one of the grandmothers there was hanging out with the family we were staying with, and she demanded to see my palm. And I was like, sure. It just seemed polite, and she's translating through the girl who was about my age. And I was like, why does she want to see my palm? She's like, she's going to read it. And I was like, okay, please. I don't know what her system was or what it was, but she told me things that are still true and playing out to this day. Like, there's a whole series of things I have basically written down that I go back to, and on the timing she told me it would happen, they are happening in my life, which was an incredibly moving and strange experience, particularly since it was being translated the whole time. And it was also coupled with the fact that she got very cranky with me because I had been taking apparently too many naps in the park, which she was mad about, which was actually true. I used to nap in the park all the time. She was like, no more naps in the park. And also you're going to live a freakishly long time. I was like, that sounds good. I can do that. And then from there, I kind of put it away, other than the sort of, like I was saying, the dream and prophecy component that seemed natural from growing up. And then in graduate school, I decided I was going to put myself through the Golden Dawn Crowley kind of stuff. And I picked up a Thoth deck and started playing with it. And I was the world's worst Tree of Life reading bro for like the longest time. Like I can still see the faces of people at parties who are like, can you tell my fortune? And I'm like, yes, let's get into some Malkuth. We're going into some Sephiroth. And they're like, I just wanted to know if I could buy beer or not from this guy. It'd be super great. I'm like, no, there's 34 more minutes of path working to do before we get anywhere close to an answer. So I did that for a while. It's crap. And then it's good for certain things, but it's not my favorite way of doing divination, actually. And so that after that, I sort of moved on into tarot and geomancy and kept going from there. But yeah, that first one is really that Bosnian grandma. Yeah.
That's really fantastic. I really wish we could hear more about her method. I'm like, oh, that sounds so fascinating. But that's wonderful that you had that experience. So your family did then do a lot of paying attention to dreams, and that stuck with you.
Yeah.
That you still, I'm sure, still do today as part of your magical practice as well.
I would say dream work is the foundation of a large part of my magical practice. Yeah. I think it's one of those things you really can't. Oh God, this is the worst. You can't sleep on your dream work. Yeah, I know. I'm sorry, but it is the easiest access we have to spirit contact on a regular basis. We have it all the time, and I find that regular dream work also bleeds into all other aspects of your magical practice very quickly. You know, any kind of journeying, vision work. Seeing spirits around you, it all gets easier once you have an active dream practice. So
this kind of is cutting way further ahead in the questions I was planning to ask you. But since we're talking about dreams,
sure.
The book of poetry that you and Jess Waters put out, can you tell us a little bit about that and how that relates to dreams?
Yes, definitely. And since Jess is here tonight, she can yell at me in the chat if I screw anything up. No, that work is a series of haiku that we wrote together, looking at the nakshatra, the Vedic mansions of the moon. We were looking at this time, some of the Rune Soup members were doing various kinds of nakshatra walks and trying to understand that relationship. And Jess and I decided to do the whole walk. And then while doing it, had the idea that we wanted to bring something back. So, this whole idea of engaging with the realm and bringing back a song to make these things manifest. So we wanted to know the virtues of the dreamings of the nakshatra, and we asked for it, and we got it. And then we wrote some haikus. And the thing that was really fun was, and we didn't plan this, was that the two haiku, I would write one and Jess would write one. And then we realized that many of them actually read across. And so you can actually see how they interact with each other, even though while we were having very similar dream experiences, we wrote them up separately. We had a separate process that then came back together. So our hope is that, it's fun to read, and then also that it provides a way for people to think about engaging with various spirits, but particularly the nakshatra spirits, which I highly recommend doing that work, particularly when your planetary astrology is less than pleasant. The nakshatras go to the stars, and it's helpful. So,
Well, I want to come back to that a little bit later, but you mentioned that after going through your phase of the Sephiroth and all of that at parties, you then have gone to other forms of tarot and geomancy. So it's interesting to me that you read professionally for people in using both methods. I mean, of course, there are other people that do multiple forms of divination, but you have really stuck very closely to those two. You obviously, people can choose what form of divination they would like you to read using when they ask you a question. But when you read for yourself, are there ways that you think about which form of divination you would rather consult on a question? Or is it really just what's to hand or what intuition tells you?
No, so it's definitely not just what intuition tells. Well, it's always sort of what intuition tells you. But so the way I got back into doing regular divination was through doing geomancy. As I started to get more into understanding sort of, grimoire magic and traditional Western magic in various different ways, it became clear that astrology was something I would need to reckon with. And I don't hate astrology, but I hate doing astrology. Like I really don't enjoy that much math. And so I was like, listen, I want an objective system that can give me a kind of global look. And at this point, Sam Block and Al Cummins were starting to talk a lot more about geomancy. And I was like, sure, let me give that a whirl, which then forced me to learn an absolute mountain's worth of astrology. So it failed completely at that. But one of the things I like about geomancy is that it has a very kind of almost rude, practical sense about how it approaches problems. It's very conservative. It doesn't really care what your feelings are. It just tells you, like, if you ask, what should I do? It says this, one of my favorite divinations I ever did, I was looking to do some, justified curse work. And I needed to find a place to put the curse, right? And I don't believe you should just throw things wherever you want. I think you should actually ask the places that you're going to do if they want to participate in this thing. I got 20 no answers from geomancy, and then I got one yes, right? And that for me and then the experience itself was really intense. But that for me was the kind of thing I want. I want to be able to say, like, yes or no, this or that, and I don't want to get confused by the pictures, right? When I don't want to leave myself any wiggle room, when I don't want to explore around, I go to geomancy. Now, tarot, I like tarot for its larger story element. So if you want to know, will I get my job? Will I land this job? I would say, let's look at geomancy and we can look at all the different factors that are going there. If you're like, how can I improve my relationship with my friend? Then I want to go to tarot, because there are these subtleties of emotion and play back and forth in sort of a human drama that I think are much more reflected in the symbol set of tarot. Geomancy would probably say something along the lines of, like, get new friends. And, it's just, that's true. That will improve your friendship relations, right? But it lacks that kind of social nuance. So that tends to be how I read. Also, if I'm doing readings with other magicians, I tend to read tarot because geomancy is still less well known and it takes a while to get a chart put together. So I believe when we were all at drinks, Gordon was like, "Oh, good, D&D nerds doing divination."
Yes. I am a big fan of geomancy. I mean, the first guest we had on was Sam Block, because I'm like, yes, yeah. Geomancy for the world.
I really do think it is. There was a reason it was so popular in the Renaissance. There's a reason that, people should listen to the interview you had with Sam, because you all covered all the bases on that stuff. But so I think it's a tool that people should be aware of and should have, particularly when you don't want to give yourself an out. Like, you don't have to give yourself an out with tarot. You can be Camellia Elias, read like the devil, and really, read yourself to filth. But there's more options for giving yourself an out. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very true. So you moved away from the Thoth deck, and
I got tired of being yelled at all the time.
I can say I will admit that is a deck I do not really know. I'm so sorry. I should, but I don't.
It will read. It just sounds like Uncle Aleister Crowley yelling at you the whole time.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So, no thanks.
So in moving away from that, what was the tarot deck that kind of came for you next? Did you go to the Rider-Waite versions? Did you go into other territory?
Yeah, so I tried to read for a long time with basically every single kind of tarot I could pick up that was a Rider-Waite Smith variant. in part because I still had this holdover of that Golden Dawn reading. I felt like I'd done all this work and it gave me an insight. So even when I was trying to do more practical readings, I wanted that sort of hand-holding background. But when the Rune Soup folks took the tarot course and I started reading more of Camellia Elias's work, I started looking at the Marseille deck, and it lit me on fire. Like I adore the Marseille deck. There's something about it that reaches into my soul and just says like, yeah, no, this is the core of what we're talking about here. And what actually, the majors are fantastic, but what really got me was the pips. Just spending time trying to understand what the sevens can do, right? Like, what does it mean to encounter 3 sevens in a reading? Like, what does it mean to then take those cards and make them three-dimensional? So like to walk yourself through a forest of 7 of cups, right? Like, so we have the 3 up front and the 3 in the back and the 1 in the middle. Like, what is that positional relationship? And I realized that the Rider-Waite-Smith minors, which are beautiful, were too heavy for me. Like there's too much of an interpretation laid on it already for me to play around in. Whereas like with the major arcana, like they're so big, right? You can see how they play. But you know, what is it? The 3 of swords that has the heart? And
that's the 3 of swords. Yeah.
Yeah. So like that reads so much sorrow to me already that I can't find other meanings in it. Whereas once we get into the way that the pips and the Marseille play around, yeah, it's just more flexibility for me. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the concepts can be, well, as Camellia says, like 1 is a little, 10 is a lot. It's, you know, right. It can be simply what it is without having too many layers already placed on top of it. Not that the layers don't have a lot of meaning and can't be, you know, very valuable information, but yeah, it's a world. Yeah.
I honestly think that it's worth playing around with any deck you find, and just seeing what it has to tell you. I just think that something about the age and the motion that is present in the Marseille decks. I mean, I was a medievalist in school. So, you know, the more something looks like it fell out of a 14th century person's, you know, pocket at the tavern, they didn't have pockets, purse at the tavern, you know, that just makes me happy. But, yeah, being able to come to a different deck and pick it up and play with it is also really important. Have you ever had the Wildwood Tarot? Have you seen that one?
Wildwood Tarot happens to be one of the decks that my coven works with a lot. Okay,
so I was gifted the Wildwood Tarot because for a while I was doing readings in the context of being a youth advisor for the Unitarian Universalist Church.
Makes sense.
Yeah, this is my extreme youth pastor moment. But they didn't want anything that had nudity in it. So someone gave me the Wildwood and I started playing with it. I don't personally enjoy the iconography. I don't. It bothers me. It's very Celtic Twilight, and it gets in my head, and I don't like that it's arrows. Like I don't like it. It reads like a dream. That deck will answer almost anything. Like I don't know what happened, but it's my favorite of the Rider-Waite-Smith derivations. So like and I think, you know, if you only read with things you like, you're never going to understand that. You'll never understand that this other deck could present things to you that you don't know.
Yeah, I like that concept of reading with things that are different because, yeah, Wildwood deck is something that I'm actually very comfortable with for that very reason. And I have found over the years that I've worked with it that it works incredibly well. And the imagery doesn't work for everyone. It's fine. There's plenty of decks that I've had people read phenomenally for me on that when I picked it up, I was like, I don't know. Yep. Doing it for me. But when they read with it, it was just amazing. But I think it is really important what you bring up of breaking yourself out of your comfort zone, of not just staying with what you're always used to using. But that's very interesting.
And being open too. I mean, because it's a weird thing to think there are decks that you may or may not speak with the imagery, but you can still read them. Like that is its own weird, you know, so now we're talking about the spirit of the deck, right? And I don't know, I can't remember the name of the deck creators for that one, but they got whatever current they hit something real, and you can feel it. And there's lots of those hidden out there. You come across them and you're like, ooh, that's got a little fire on it.
My favorite story was I had a kitten deck that someone gave me as a joke, and then they wanted me to read at a party. And unfortunately, that one was reading people to filth like you wouldn't believe. And I'm like, man, these kittens, they are not nice. This is not, I don't want to be having to tell people these things, but no.
Kittens don't care.
Kittens did not care.
No.
So yes, when you are reading for yourself, are there times when you would ask the same question of both forms of divination, or are you always just, you stick to one or the other? Or if it's something really burning, you're going to go ask both friends. Do you know what I mean?
I do think there's value in interpreting with more than one style of divination. I'm not someone who says if you ask the question one way, you should not ask it from the other oracle. I think, getting a second opinion is sometimes really useful. I tend to use them. I tend to think geomancy for strategy and tarot for tactics.
Mm-hmm.
So if you come to the end of a sentence and it's, you've asked the question like, should I be traveling? And you get via, populace, and then via as the judge. So it's like, yeah, you're going on a trip, right? And it's going to be complicated and you're going through a lot of stuff. But it's definitely this almost too much trip is happening, right? Like it's reflected. But sometimes you can be like, well, what do you mean there's too much trip here, right? Like, what do you mean my trip is reflected back on itself, and that means I'm taking an extra long trip? You may have some follow-up, right? But since you're dealing with 16 figures you're dealing with more because every judge combination, you're reading a 3-pattern thing. But sometimes you get through the houses, you get through everything else, and you're like, I just still don't quite feel what this is going to look like. And so that's when I typically go to tarot at that point to follow up and say, okay, who am I going to meet on this trip? Like, who am I looking for? What kind of people am I going to hang around? What's a particular disaster that could happen? And so you can throw those spreads really quickly. And so I like that kind of follow up to a bigger picture. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. So speaking of what you were just doing in terms of expanding on a question, is there the key? I think I've heard you say this as well, but some of the key to having a good reading is knowing really what your question is and formulating that question really well. Is there advice that you might want to share about how you think about asking questions or finding your question?
It's interesting because I think I'm actually better at helping other people find their questions than when I bring a question to a reader. I often, I'll bring it and they're like, this is a garbage question. And I'm like, I know, I'm crying. I can't think right now. Help fix my question. But that being said, I think that at a base level, learning to ask better questions is one of the benefits of the practice of divination, is that you ask a question, you get a result, it makes perfect sense, the event happens, and you're like, oh, if I had not thrown mush at this problem, I might have had a better outcome, right? So one of the things and I got this from taking classes from Al Cummins, should is kind of a real nightmare of a word to throw into a divination question, in the sense that, like, should, according to who, should I leave well, there's only one, should I leave my boyfriend? The answer is always yes. But once you get past that, should I try out for this job? Well, what do you mean by should? What do you really want out of that job? Will you get more money if you apply for this job? Will you lose your family if you apply for this job? Like, there's a whole spectrum of things that, if I don't understand what should means for me or for the querent, like, you're going to get a mess of an answer. So I like drilling into that. Also, I like the process of finding out your own desires more. For me, magic and divination are all very intensely desire based, and I celebrate that. And so drilling down to understand your actual desire is worth 5 minutes of re-asking your question, right? Like, should I get this apartment? Okay. Throw out should. Will this apartment be a good place for me to study my magic? Okay, interesting. Do you care if it has a floor? Like, do you care if it's also a good place to bring someone back to? Like, and so keep moving and moving and moving until you get at the core of what you're trying to understand.
Which is always very much a process. And I know what you mean. It's very true. You can always, it's so much easier to tell someone else how to ask a good question. But when it comes to your own question, sometimes goo.
Oh, mostly goo. Yeah. I have to be meanest with myself. Yeah.
I think that speaking about questions, I wanted to let the people who are here know, and I'm going to place it in the chat, that Brian has graciously agreed that he's going to actually answer a few people's questions, not just, through this, but through divination. So if you have a question for him to divine on, I'm going to put in the chat the form link, and this will then be completely anonymous. So when you place a question for him into this form and submit it, I will not know who it came from. And I'm going to choose a few questions, depending on how much time we have when we get towards the end, for him to read. And if you want when you ask the question, when you put it in that form, if you want to specify whether you'd like him to answer by a couple of cards or, geomancy, you can do that. Or if you just want to leave it open-ended, just put the question in the form and that's it. And I'm going to check back on that form. If there's any trouble with the form, just put it in the chat and Daryl and I can handle it. But so yes, so now that you've heard him talk about questions, you can actually spend some time thinking about formulating one.
I like that bit of homework. I will judge your questions.
You may now begin formulating your questions. Begin now. Thank you. Now, so you've already basically touched on how you think about the two different forms of divination, but the question that I sometimes come back to is, are there times when you feel that the form of divination is answering the question that was asked or the question that people should have asked? That is sometimes I think Sam was talking about this in reference to geomancy and the difference between geomancy and other forms, talking about how it could potentially just answer exactly the question you asked, literally. Or, some forms of divination might give you a little wiggle room and say, well, what you really meant here was X, so I'm going to answer that question.
I am suspicious of what you really meant here. I think that happens sometimes. Where I have seen that most is when you sort of invoke a particular set of spirits. So if you are trying to communicate with your ancestors and you're like, should I get this new car? You might get an answer that's like, you need to spend money. You need to save money for your kids' tuition, right? Like you might get a more specific kind of return. But I think in a more general divination sense, I don't like to leave myself options for, oh, I should interpret it this way. Like, oh, it's actually this. I think what I have seen most commonly when I've read for other people and they ask me that question, like, oh, could it mean this, right? You get that thrown back at you sometimes. It's usually just a way to get out of the horrible thing that they just saw. And so what I would prefer actually is just deal with what you see. And then if you don't like it, now let's talk magic. Now let's talk ways around it. I'm changing things. I was doing a reading one time for myself about whether my family members would be safe on a particular trip, right? Because I was nervous about it. And the answer was no. Like just flat out no. Now I could have tried to read that in a way that was like, oh, maybe it means that, you know what I mean? Like you can start to do that and because you don't want to look at the scary thing you're looking at. Instead, I decided to go on the trip. I was originally not going to go. I was like, okay, I'm changing some of the features. I'm going to go on the trip. If I go with them, is it fine? And then the answer was yes. If you let yourself wiggle, you're never going to get that kind of data. And so, yeah, I don't like to do that.
Mm-hmm. Just out of curiosity, was that geomancy or tarot that you got that?
That was geomancy. Yeah.
It just sounded like a geomancy kind of answer, which is why I asked.
Yeah, definitely. I was like, nope.
Yeah.
Doom and despair.
So in that case, this kind of ties a little bit into the next question is, how do you relate to developing practice and technique with some of these things? Because there are some people who advise, if when you're really attempting to develop your practice and develop your relationship or skill, however you want to think about it, with a form of divination, that you practice every single day and you kind of just go to the cards or go to the runes or whatever, just to kind of get that connection built up? Or do you think it's better to kind of hang back and really only go to these forms of divination when you have like a true desire, a true need for an answer?
More the second, but I qualify that a little bit because I think, I think all those needs and desires are sacred too. So from like, will this book get here on time? This book I really want and this thing I'm writing, and I need to know if it's going to get here. That's just as valid to me as is my family going to arrive safe, as far as like a divination question, right? So I'm not a fan of daily draws. I'm not a fan for divination purposes, right? I'm not a fan of that. I think it's worth, though, looking around and being like, there's probably enough stuff in your life to divine on that you could divine every day. And I went through, before I decided to be professional about it, I made sure I had done 50 readings for other people for free before I had done, before I charged. And the being open to taking on other people's work is another great way to practice, right? So just, sitting down and saying like, listen, I'm still working this stuff out, like being very upfront. Can I read for you? That's when we get into those more daily practices that I think are more useful. What I prefer to do for daily work, because I think you should practice divination every day. I don't know if you should read all the time. So what I prefer to do in that case is to actually sit with a card or sit with a figure and do the meditation. John Michael Greer in his book on geomancy is very specific about the sort of journey work you can do with the figures. Most geomancers actually talk about that. And I think it's doing that kind of work every day is extremely useful. I used to do, with geomancy in particular, I would just walk around and do the computations in my head to combine various figures. So so I just saw this, I'm walking by a road. If I put, Puella next to Via, what does it look like? If I do this, if I do that. And so running through the computations and sitting with the figures, that was extremely useful because you learn your language, right? Same thing with tarot. Like, people should be sitting with the three of coins and just going, what is this? Like, what do I understand about it? So if your daily draw practice is, here's a card and think about it, I think that's essential. If it's, what does this one card tell me about how my day is going to go? For me, that works less well. Yeah.
Yeah. It's the time spent with that, right, in order to get deeper into it. Yeah. Do you, just as out of curiosity, have you done, I mean, as you were saying, when you're walking around and you're on a road and you think about combining the figures together, that's something that's kind of a part of your daily life. Do you do, or did you in the past do journey work to kind of like, as you were saying, like John Michael Greer's, kind of entering into that? Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I've done journey work on all the cards and all the figures, and I still do. I think that's essential. Like, now I tend to do it when I'm approaching a remediation, right? Or when I'm thinking about doing magic involving geomancy or tarot. I will sit down and try to understand the figure or the card more intensely. But I do think it's worthwhile just to I think journey work is, again, something everyone should be doing all the time. So, I got the weird visions of like, what is it like to walk into, Puer and see the sword and see the weird fiery nature of, that space. And obviously with all journey and active imagination stuff, you sort of give it a language to start with that's in your brain. You're like, here we go. Here you go, spirit. Here's what I brought today. And then it shows you something else and you follow that and you learn. And I think you can do that easily with this stuff.
I am 100% in agreement with that.
And it's, I mean, it's shocking. And I think that's something people need to know too. It's fun, but you're going to learn things you didn't think about before. And then that will bleed over to your day-to-day life. Like you're going to start walking around and these things will just leap out of you, out of the patterns you're seeing around you. So, that's fine too. Just occasionally banish and cleanse.
So I have a couple of questions about reading for other people and how you think about that. And my first question really is, what are some of the challenges that you've come up against in reading for other people? What are some of the hardest things about reading professionally for someone? I mean, or reading even for your friends, but in terms of doing work for others as opposed to for yourself.
So I am naturally fairly good at reading people. And that gets in the way of a good divination practice to some extent. It is useful. And you'll notice that almost all the people who write about it say that like this intuition is a useful thing to have. Like, don't ignore it. Right. But if it leads ahead of the cards or ahead of the figures and you're grasping after what you think you're picking up sort of psychically or however you want to define that, that muddies a reading and it makes it difficult. The other thing that can happen is you'll pick up stuff. Geomancy is interesting too, because someone will ask me about what's like a second house issue, so money or whatever. And while you're looking over the chart, you'll see something in their relationship. And you're like, I'm going to tell them about this. Now, sometimes that's appropriate because the figure jumped, or there's or the person and you have a relationship, so you can speak to them and be like, hey, there's a thing over here. But sometimes the person did not want you staring into their marriage, right? They asked you about money, and that's something to resist. If you're chasing after that psychic hit of, I think there's a problem here and I want to go after it, that's not as good, right? So that's the first biggest problem. The second, I have a tendency to want to offer advice. And I've gotten around this by usually throwing a second chart or throwing some cards and saying, what do the cards advise? I don't think it's a professional diviner's place to personally advise a client in that way. I think, and there's exceptions. Someone could say, what would you do here? And you can say, this is what I would do. But they're there for the interaction with the spirits, with the cards, and with the figures. And so to interpose your personal advice that is probably not based on the spirit's reading, I think is a problem. I try not to do that.
Well, it's that the line between how much of divination is interpretation and, subjective versus objective, and how do you kind of try to keep a line there that is appropriate, but also not making a separation that isn't really possible there. Do you know what I mean? There are certain things that you can separate yourself from, or like you were saying, chasing sort of a psychic hit of saying, right. I see this, therefore I'm going to go in that direction, even if that's maybe not the most appropriate at the time.
Yeah, I think you are a part of the reading. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And that's one reason to go to different readers. If you want me to read for you, you need to understand it's going to be the information is coming filtered through my imagination, my set of information, all of that. You're going to get weird references to the Middle Ages. I'm very sorry. It happens. So to say the reader is just a sort of computer that puts out information is incorrect. At the same time, that dance of not too much me is a good one to play with, I think.
Mm-hmm. When you do see things that are challenging for people, or let's say someone gets, well, you're not reading with Rider-Waite, so I'm not going to go with the Three of Swords example. But let's say that, someone is the answer that you're getting for what they wanted, particularly maybe with geomancy, is very much a no. Do you find it difficult to tell people that, or have you found that it's usually pretty straightforward?
What I like to think, I mean, obviously it's hard sometimes when you're like, this says no. Someone wants a certain thing to happen in their life, and they want an old lover to come back. Is this going to work out? No, it's not. That is a hard thing to look someone in the eye and tell them, even if you're saying, I'm just reading the cards, right? Like cards say no. Still, you're taking someone's desire and saying it's not there. I temper that with a couple things. I like to say, why isn't it there? So what about this? What does the cards tell us about why this isn't working? And that can often, I think, give people more perspective. The other thing is like, is your family safe? No. Okay, that's not great. What can I do about that? Because I don't think we're locked into a fate pattern. I think that we are looking at percentage movements of flow, right? So like all things being the same, this is the direction things are heading. Okay, well, I can change a lot of things. So sometimes some things are worth fighting for. So it depends. So because I am comfortable letting the other person tell me if they want to give up or they want to fight, I don't mind telling them the no.
Mm-hmm. With the understanding that then sometimes the next question is what can be done with these sets of circumstances now being known? What do we do about that?
Yeah. And sometimes the answer is accept it. Mm-hmm. Like it really is. There's some stuff you cannot push. But there's a lot of stuff you can, and less bad is infinitely better. So, yeah, I mean, sometimes I listen to the astrologers talk about like, this is the stars, this is the fate. We take a stoic approach and we accept it. And I'm like, or you could do magic. Try that. If you're right about stoicism, I'm just going to fail anyway. I might as well, fail on my own feet with my sword in my hand. So let's see if we can do that.
Or have a little fun, light some candles. I mean,
yeah,
draw some sigils. They're pretty looking. But yes, speaking of fate and free will, so looking at that, it's just, it's so fascinating to look at and think about the different ways that we can we can at least try to influence our fate. So I'm assuming that divination is very much part of your magical practice.
It is, yeah.
Can you just tell us a little bit about that?
I have come to believe that you should not do magic without divination, period. You should, you're like, I would like to do magic.
No, yeah.
Yeah. Step one, I would like to do magic. Cool. Do some divination. And like sometimes that's a dream. Sometimes that's, an actual divinatory practice. But if you're, for me, magic is all about interacting with spirits. So, you just got to presume. People always like spirits lie. Sure, they definitely do. But also you're talking about communication over a really complicated system of interspecies, diplomacy, basically, right? So you may not have this idea correct, and getting as much information as you can without freezing yourself is important. I tend to think in terms of the larger free will, choice options, that there probably are big patterns that are created by the way that everybody moves together, right? The spirit of the world moves. So there's these big patterns inside that. But then once you're inside that pattern, there's a lot to move around in. You can, I was just recently read to filth on my own astrology by my friend Jake. And my Mars, he was like, "Oh boy, everything's on fire for you." And I was like, "Yes, it is." Thank you. But even there, it's like, okay, so how do you want to approach that? What do you want that to look like? And that makes your life very different. One of the things, this is a weird tangent maybe, but I got really obsessed after I got done with the Golden Dawn stuff with Franz Barden. Do you know Franz Barden?
Okay, so Franz Barden, Initiation into Hermetics, was like one of the first pagan books I had when I was 13, I think.
Oof, 13 is a hard age to hit that one.
I did not get through that book at 13, but yes, I still have my copy, and I did do some of it even at 13. So yes, Franz Barden.
So my take on Barden is that Barden is actually a legit magician, that if you did Barton's system, you're going to turn out a pretty powerful magician. It's hard. It's real hard work. And I think a lot of it, it's very of its time. And so you can get where he wants you to get with a lot better methods now, frankly.
Yes.
But one of the things about Barton that was really interesting to me is when I was younger, I got really obsessed with this idea that we would all end up in camps. Barton was in he was arrested lots of times and in concentration camps. And I got obsessed with the idea that like you would need to do magic with nothing. What if you had nothing? This is one of the reasons geomancy is appealing, right? Mm-hmm. But when I was reading through Barton, there's a point where you're like, did he know he was going to end up in these situations? Like, was this his fate the entire time? And I think to some extent he probably did. I mean, he designed a system that you can use under any circumstance with just your brain, basically, and the ability to talk to some spirits. So there's the sense of like premonition that being who you are might end you up in some pretty bad circumstances over the course of your life. Do you know how Franz Barton died?
I feel like I did know.
Okay.
I think actually you told me.
I might have told you this. This is one of my favorite things.
A long time ago, and I've already forgotten. So there we go.
So Barton, once the Soviets took over his country, he ended up back in prison again, right? Because for being a healer and a witch. And he had pancreatitis. And he had decided he was done. He did not want to didn't want to be in jail anymore. And so he asked his wife to bring him a bacon sandwich. And she got it past the guards and everything else. And he ate the bacon sandwich and he died. He killed himself with a bacon sandwich. And what I love about this story, I know it's grim. What I love about it is it's kind of the weirdest free will example I can come up with, where he's like, listen, I can't push the big Soviet empire over, but I can refuse to be a part of this anymore. And I can refuse to do so by bacon sandwich, which is literally, I don't know, that suits me down to a T.
Drink hemlock, eat bacon sandwich.
Listen, if you're going to make your choices, right? Like, which one would you like?
Yes.
So, but that's just to say, I think he did a lot of good in his lifetime. He healed a lot of people, taught a lot of kindness to people. And I think that's where you have to end up is I'm not responsible for big fate, but I'm going to at least work as hard as I can to make everything as nice and kind as I can for everyone else while I'm here.
I think that leads just beautifully into the fact that I wanted you to talk to everyone who is listening, who doesn't already know about intention magic and the work that you've done with that, which is part of one of the ways that I know you, is for those who don't know, both Brian and I are members of Rune Soup, which is run by Gordon White. And there's been intention groups going for years at this point, I believe, correct?
Yeah, I think we're coming up on year 3, or we're in our 3rd year, I think, of regular, at least with the EST Wednesday night group. I think we're coming into year 3.
So for people who haven't heard of what intention magic or prayer, or however you want to phrase it, is, could you just briefly describe what that work is like?
Yeah. Lynne McTaggart put a book out called The Power of 8, which is worth your time. And basically what she did is she harnessed, my read on it is that she took a look at what is effectively Christian small group prayer magic and turned it into a more ecumenical sort of new age approach to picking up a technology that did not have to be tied to a particular dogma. And the method is extremely simple, which is, I think, people pass on the simple magic all the time. People really want to put that lion skin belt on and like, sure, like you do you, but like there's so much powerful base level magic out there that you could be doing in your life. And people are like, it's not flashy. Well, you know what? It's not flashy, but it cures cancer. So her intention is if you get a group together, and she chose 8 kind of randomly. I actually think the where 2 or more are gathered rule works pretty well with intentions. You sit down, you take, if the person is physically present with you, you don't need a picture, but if you are distant, and you can definitely do this over Zoom. That's how I've done 3 years of the work. you bring people together. You usually show a picture of the target or the person you're intending for. You come up with a statement that reflects what you're after. I think people get hung up on statements too much, but you want to get to the feeling of what you actually desire for that person. And then you spend 10 minutes just wishing that desire for that person with a compassionate heart. And that's it. In our group, we do a couple other things that we have found useful as magicians. So we usually have a invocation to the Agathos Daimon as a sort of guardian and tutelary spirit of our work. And then we still use the music that Lynne McTaggart used in her groups, which is the Choku Rei music. And oh my God, if I could come up with I need to do like 2 weeks of testing for some other music. I need something else. I hear it in my sleep now because I don't just do it on Wednesdays. I started a Discord group to do on the fly intentions for people who needed it. And so like I'll do easily 7 intentions a week. So it's always in my brain.
I can hear the opening chord now.
I've gotten so I can time it. Like I can tell, even though it's a repetitive thing, I can be like, yes, we are at 3 minutes and 45 seconds. Like it's awful. Intention, but what are the results, right? So intention magic, I think is probably best for, and Lynn found this too, for increasing or healing things. And the way I like to describe it is you sort of are bringing the best timeline for that event into place for the person. One of the mistakes people often make is trying to power this themselves. And actually I got this warning from Barden, who says like, when you do energy healing, it's not your energy, it's the universal energy. Right. And so that's something we try to watch out for, but we have seen, I think one of my favorite examples is we were told about a child who had a brain cancer, and he was 2, something like that. And he was at all the, real fancy institutions and everything else. And we were told that he had the worst diagnosis possible. We did an intention for him. The person we had done it for called us back within 2 weeks and said he got reevaluated. And it turned out instead of the worst kind of diagnosis, he actually had the best kind of diagnosis. So the doctors who'd originally done it were superseded by this other doctor who came in out of nowhere to say like, no, it's actually the best kind. You read that completely wrong, even though you are the doctor at this institution. And then within a month, he was back home and fine and totally fine. So yeah, you could have summoned a demon to do the same thing, or you could sit with 8 friends for 10 minutes and try to do it. I think this stuff works because this is a part of our natural human job. I think this is what we should be doing for each other. And so this is part of just doing what humans do. There have been stuff that it doesn't always work. You know what I mean? Like in like every other real intervention in technology, there are times it doesn't work the way you want it to. But it is enough that it is reality breaking. And sometimes people have a hard time with that. It's a lot to figure out. The other thing about it is that it works really well for the people doing it. So if you do intention magic on a regular basis, you see an uplift in your health, in lowered depression, in increased compassion. Basically, every like long-term meditative goal goes incredibly up. Brain scans are kind of garbage, but they did brain scans of people who had been meditating for 30 years and were considered experienced and dedicated meditators. And they would get into their meditative state and they would scan the brain. That's what it looks like. Cool. People who had done nothing were scanned while they were doing the 10 minutes of intention. And for those 10 minutes, their brain looked exactly like the person who'd been meditating for 30 years. And this is something we're sleeping on. So if people are interested, you don't need to be a Rune Soup member to do it. Get Lynn's book, read it, and call some of your friends over and start doing it for each other. One of the things I would love is to hear that people just do it all the time as part of their regular practice.
And it is very doable via Zoom.
Yes.
You have to be in the same physical location, which is what is so beautiful. It's amazing that it is that, but it is.
It has provided, in addition to, for me personally, I mean, I have been helped by it. Like, it's not just something where I do this for people. Like in fact, the first big one we did was helping find one of my aunt's relatives who had been lost. And literally, full statewide search, hadn't found her, everything else. They'd been walking by the cave she had gone into after a car wreck. And within 10 minutes of us doing the intention, she walked out of the cave and walked over to people and was like, "Hey, what's up?" So like, it is something I have benefited from there. It has been one of the most moving experiences of my life to encounter compassion from my friends on such a regular basis. And I cannot recommend it enough for people. Yeah.
Yes, and I think that then goes back to our discussion about, divination and free will and all of these things. These are places and ways that we as magicians or as witches or as whatever, spiritual people, however you want to call yourself, cunning people, whatever, where we can find places that we can push on and then we can do that work that is, as you say, the work that humans are meant to be doing. It's not saying you can do everything. Just like divination, you're going to sometimes get readings where it's like, no, that's not going to work. So sorry. But there are many places and times when we can do a lot more than we think.
I would agree with that. I think it can be hard to try to think out, why does one person get a miracle and the other person? So one of the things I believe firmly is it always helps. And I think this is actually true. I have even the outcomes that have looked grimmer than I wanted them to, or I would not count as a full success, because I don't like the idea that like I prayed for someone's cancer to go away and it got a little bit better, but then it didn't go away, right? Like that's not a success, right? However, I think it always adds benefit. And that's something that people aren't always comfortable with. The other thing that's weird, people often want the immediate miracle, right? They want like, your cancer to be gone tomorrow. But I'll tell you what, sometimes that's not okay. The life you have, if you are suddenly a miracle cure from cancer in a public way, means that now you're spending the next 3 years with people poking and examining you to see what happened. Whereas if it had taken 6 months and nobody had noticed and you got better anyway, your life might actually be better. So we have this sort of Hollywood like idea that magic should work immediately and it should be dramatic and there should be fire. But I think it's more commonly a process. We don't like process, right? But like at the end, that's what I think all this really is about. I like getting in the flow of a process and seeing how it goes.
Yes. And that is it's a very wonderful process. So I completely echo what you say about getting Lynne McTaggart is her name. Someone asked in the chat what.
I'll add
and also this is all going to be in the show notes. So a lot of these details, I'll make sure when this is all posted that there's links to these things that we talked about. So there'll be that as well. And this kind of goes to, well, I have some questions I want to ask more towards the end. So I think I'll kind of save those for the moment because we've had a ton of questions come through. So many people want you to read for them.
Let's do it.
We're not going to get to all of them, but I'll choose a couple. Like I said, I promise it's random. Okay.
Well, do you mind us doing that? Denise, you asked about doing divination during a moon void. Mm-hmm. I do. Yeah. I think geomancy is very much about like, are you in the right place? Right? Like, are you in this? And there are some rules about thunderstorms and things, which I also ignore.
I was going to ask you that question, so you ignore it? Okay, good.
I mean, I take it into account. So that's what I do with all this stuff. If the reading feels weird, I'll be like, wait, where's the moon? What's going on? Because I think that does play a course in it. I just don't think you have to not do it because that's there. I think you should just pay attention to what's happening around you.
Okay, so we have a few questions, and the first one is, will the registration come this week? So it's a time one.
Let's do a geomancy one. So for the geomancy stuff, I am going to do I think Dr. Al talks about this as like a pub crawl method, where what you do is you just throw two figures and add them together, right? So if I was going to do a full chart for this, I could actually go through and do the divination timing method that Geomancy has and see if it'll be on time. But like, we can do just kind of a more general, like yes, no, will it be on time? Question. Hold on. I got to do my. So one of the other things is I do think that you should do prayer before you do divination. So I'm doing just like a big group one real fast. And if people hear me doing dice, I do use the Platonic dice method that Sam Block talks about. And that makes for quicker, easier readings. Okay, so the figure that first came up was Rubius, which is the overturned cup, which is like, if I was doing a traditional reading, that's one of the things would be like,
Would stop that reading.
I'm gonna halt it and see how you're doing, and we'll have a chat about it. It's not what it usually means is that there's something wrong with the question set. So there's an idea of like, anger, there's too much anger, there's too much emotion going around on this thing, it's too obsessive. You may also be lying to me on some level, or like malevolent, angry towards me. I would have to see the rest of the chart to see how that plays out. But since we're doing pub crawl method, I don't think that's actually what's going on. So it's Rubius plus Puella. So that's a figure that looks like a cross. I'll show you my little weird figures if you want to see them. And that gives us via, right? So the road. So what you're having is anger is running into this hostess function, right? And then things have to go, right? Like, when you anger the hostess, you're out the door. I don't think this is coming in. What was the actual wording?
Is the registration, will the registration come this week?
I would say no. I would say this is in process. It's going to be on a longer journey, right? It's finding its way around. I would say that in this case, via is very much a thing of travel. So I don't think you're getting it. No, sorry. Particularly the way we get there.
I have another one. Let's see. I'm choosing at random. How about this one? Will this relationship hinder my magical development?
Yes. The answer is yes.
Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, that was the quickest divination reading.
Hold on. Will this relationship hinder my magical development? Actually, you know what? This is actually the opposite of the boyfriend one. The answer to this one is always no. I don't think your relationships tend to, but I mean, we'll see what the cards say. But like, this is just as a general principle. Like, I think relationships are things you have the opportunity to learn from at all times, even the nasty ones. Let's see. No, that's nice. So we got the sun. I'm reading with all majors, by the way, again, to be quick, and off of the Noble deck, the sort of hand-painted one a friend gave me, Matt gave me, it's really good. Wheel of Fortune and the Empress. So what we have first here is we have this sort of relationship thing, right? We have this sort of, these two together, working together, underneath the sun together. So we have the nature of the relationship there. One is clothed, one is unclothed or shirtless, one has a shirt in this particular version, and they're sort of holding on to each other. So there's this sense of like gripping with each other. Then we get the wheel, right? There's a certain amount of like things go up, things go down. People misunderstand the Wheel of Fortune all the time. It doesn't mean good or bad. It means if you get on it, shit's going to go up and go down. Like the medieval solve for this was like, don't get on the wheel. Like if you're on the wheel, things are going to revolve and go around. We end up with the person alone, but as the Empress. Right? Now the Empress is this sense of like, fecundity. You have this sense of like a sort of pregnant with power is an idea that I think is often useful there. Although this one in this deck gives the zeroest fucks about anything. Like that is the most like, I could give a shit face I've ever seen. Will it hinder your magical relationship development? Like, no, I don't think so. I think actually we move from the relationship through fate to this stronger position, this bigger figure. That is I see the Empress as a particularly magical figure in a lot of ways. Not totally sure about how the relationship's going to do, but will it hinder the relationship, like hinder the development? No, I don't think so. Yeah.
All right. I have maybe two more. Let's see if we can do two more. All right. Choosing at random. We have, will our main construction project go smoothly?
Like as in the central one, or
yes,
something that's in Maine?
Construction. Oh, no, sorry, not Maine as in the state, but okay. Maine, M-A-I-N. Will our main construction project go smoothly?
No. I feel like these are all no.
Wow.
So through Geomancy for it, you have Fortuna Major comes into, so big good fortune, the rising sun, fortune in the sense of like the Tao, right? So like my life is well arranged, and so things just fall into my pocket. Like that's big major fortune. Running into Carker, so the prison cell restriction can also be like a wizard's tower or building in this case, actually, but it is very much about restrictions, right? So, but when good fortune meets restrictions, you get loss, right? Good fortune wants to be expansive. It wants to move and have like an easy time. So I would say that it's going to get bogged down with like regulations and those kind of paperwork kind of issues, but you know, things that are restrictive in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense.
Sorry.
Yeah. Let's see. And one more. Okay. Will the move we are planning be successful?
No preference on the...
No preference. None of these gave preferences, so
okay.
Dealer's choice.
Incidentally, if people do want to let me know how these go, these sort of fast pub readings, it's really interesting to me, so I'd be curious. Okay. All right, this one's a little tricky. So what I got was conjunctio, so the figure of crossroads meeting together, you know, coming together. It's a good sense for mercurial operations. So any kind of business, commerce-y, deals kind of stuff. It's really like that contract kind of relationship from Mercury. I got that twice. So now we have a contract here and a contract here, and then we have populace. Now populace, I think of as, there's some debate about this, but I think of this as the full moon sort of figure, like everything you want is totally present in there, and there's almost too many choices. One of the other things I like to think about, one of the older terms for populace is congregatio, so a flock, right? And if you think about like 2 crows are very different than 50 crows, right? They move differently. People react differently. Like it's a different relationship. So whereas, you know, a deal might be a good thing, what I would worry about in this case is that you're running into too many things to navigate, like too many contracts, too many deals, too much stuff going on at once. It feels like it's all about that constantly. And this is a case where like, what was the exact question again? The wording?
Hold on. Will the move we are planning be successful?
So that's a case where wording can get you into some trouble and also maybe find your way out. So this has a lot of planning in it, right? There's a lot of talking back and forth. I might do different planning, right? I might take an approach here because right now, like I would say like, moving, I would, whereas for the first question, like, is something going to arrive on time? I'd be happier to see Populous, right? Like, yeah, it's going to land in your inbox. Moving, I would kind of want to see via, right? Like I'd want to see something going, and this feels stuck, right? So I would say no, but I would also say like the one you are planning, how are you planning it? What are you doing in the planning of it? Is there something you can adjust in the sense of like same move, but planned differently? So if we had gone through the whole chart, I would have looked at this, but like, are you using a certain moving company? Right? Like maybe use a different moving company. Like these are the kind of remediations you can pull at that aren't even, they are magic, but like a very sort of practical approach of like, whatever your plans are now, simplify, work down, and see if that helps. So.
And this would be a context where you would then do other readings about various options?
So I would see if there are any obvious options in the geomantic chart. So the geomancy has quite a few options where it's like, hey, pay attention to this. Yeah. You can look to the 11th house. You can look to the mark of the lot of fortune or spirit. You can consult the 8th house to see if there's any sort of magic that could be particularly looked at. So if there was an obvious thing in the chart, I would go with that. And if not, I would throw again. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. I think that all of those give a lot of things for people to chew on, and a lot of reasons to. I'm just going to plug Geomancy again.
Yeah.
This podcast is getting a little Geomancy heavy, but I just think it's fantastic. So there we go. That's my little bias that I'm just putting in there. But it is really wonderful for. Once you get into it, getting those kinds of clear answers. Although I've never done the method that you did of just the 3. So that's fantastic.
Yeah, this is fun. I would caution everyone I gave an answer to with that like, listen, if you did not like my answer, like let me know because this is a quick method and it loses some of the nuance. Geomancy does a lot with the houses and the placements, and we're losing some of that by doing this, but it is fun and quick.
Yeah. In terms of your magical practice right now, have you found that outside of obviously doing intention work, have you found that in this time of obviously upheaval, to put it mildly, very mildly, are there magical practices or divinatory practices that you've been turning to more, or that you've been finding have been, more present in your life or more helpful? Or is it just kind of just more of the same, just a continued evolution?
Yeah. So again, I told you I had a sort of weird paranoia as a kid that I might end up in a place where I can't get all the things I want or do all the things I could do. So in some ways, I feel weirdly justified. But there are things I think are important when you're facing the sort of circumstances we're in now. This is actually part of where my Taiji practice comes in. I think that you need to be I think it's a good time to be doing things to strengthen your health. And I think movement is really important for that. But if powerlifting is your thing, go for it. Like I don't think it actually matters too much that way. So making sure your body, which is your instrument, is being taken care of in a time frame where that's hard to do because of lockdowns and isolation and everything else. And that also, your emotion, most of us are dealing with a fair amount of stress. And it's hard to do good magic if you are anxious. Not saying you can't, but you just added a level of difficulty we don't need. So the body work, the energy work, I think has become really important to do. And then something I would say is that you have the capacity to leave your house in your dream whenever you want. And I think that no, it's not the same. There's things that I very much wish you and I were doing this in person. Like this would be really fun. But there is a balm in that practice of leaving the body and finding your friends and doing that kind of work. So I would say that's it. I'm trying to think if there's anything I've been avoiding. I feel like I'm busier than ever. It's the craziest thing.
So do I.
Yeah.
Definitely busier than ever.
Well, I don't have as many fowl to deal with as you do.
You are talking about chickens. I just want to be very clear for people listening on the replay.
Did that answer your question?
No, I think absolutely. And I wanted to touch briefly on, because it's a form of magic that hasn't been talked about on this podcast yet. You do work with various saints.
Yes.
Your magical practice involves work with the saints, which as a witch, I've done some work with saints, but it's definitely not a part of my main practice. And it's very fascinating. And I was wondering, we are coming up on someone's feast day. And I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about him and practices with him and how that relates to magical practices.
Yeah. So, good Baptist boy growing up. I make the joke sometimes that my mom is more worried by the rosary work I do than by the witchcraft. It's like, sure, bring your sage and leave the rosary out the door. I encountered the saint work through Rune Soup, through working with Gordon and the various courses there. And I highly recommend them if you're interested. I think it's probably the best introduction to what this is in a modern context. I would not call myself Catholic. So I want to clarify for people that doesn't come from this kind of tradition. The saints to me are the heroic dead. And there are various forms you can approach of the heroic dead. And some of these have been around for a real long time. I'm actually partial to the ones for whom there is little to no historical evidence. I like them more. And speaking of that, the saint you're referring to is Saint Cyprian. And Saint Cyprian's Day is coming up. And we're in the middle of the novena, and what people tend to call Cyprian Miss. And one of the things I find interesting is, why would you work with saints? It's an access point to teachers. We often struggle with the idea of like, where do I find a teacher to do magic? How do I understand how to do this better? And we limit ourselves to living humans. And there's no reason to do that. You can talk to the dead. You can set up an icon in your house and sit in front of it. And if you're open, that saint will teach you things if they agree to take you on. I've had a couple of saints who are like, nope, no thanks, bro. not my jam, but not Cyprian. I should clarify though, I have a particularly weird practice. So we should separate. There is South American practice with Saint Cyprian that has a long established tradition, and a lot of it comes from Portuguese traditions. I don't make claims to have access to that whatsoever. And I think there's been some very good pushback that there's a lot of Cyprian appropriation from people. At the same time, if you speak English, you have access to European traditions, and you have a right to sort of approach these forms and say, how can I work with you? I work not with Cyprian exclusively. I work with Cyprian and Justina as a combined pair. I do not, for me, I was told that I'm not to work with just Saint Cyprian. And for those who don't know the story, in brief, Cyprian was a sorcerer who did all kinds of various nasty things and gets hired to force Justina, a holy abbess and woman, to sleep with this guy who was into her. And he agrees to take the job, and everything Cyprian throws at Justina doesn't work. She gets rid of it all with the sign of the cross. And at the end, Cyprian approaches the devil and is like, what kind of bullshit is this? I thought I signed on to be all powerful. And the devil's like, well, there's the cross thing. It's kind of a big deal for us. We don't really do that. And Cyprian says, well, then I'm done. Right. And he goes to Justina and he says, I want to learn from you. And I want to know what you know. And so in the version I understand, he becomes her student and she teaches him. And in a lot of the traditions, he doesn't give up his magic. He just repurposes it. If you look at the ancient prayer of Saint Cyprian, which is in Cyprian of Antioch, Mage of Many Faces by Frater Acher, which is a great book. he starts by confessing that he's done all this cursing his whole life. And it's particularly weird. And the one note he gives is he's like, yeah, every time I walk past a flock of sheep, I made all their bowels fall out. And you're like, dude, come on. Like, this is not nice.
Wow.
Yeah. Apparently that was his game. But when he says that he gets right with the spirit, when he settles this, what the prayer says is that he then goes and blesses everything. He doesn't not do magic. He goes and he does the magic he ought to be doing. He causes the rain to fall in the fields. He makes sure pregnancies are safe. So Cyprian became a way into a sort of patron saint of sorcerers, right? But I think when you align it with Justina, now you're actually talking about a complicated relationship of different energies that are present there, sort of a hard and soft presence, not stronger than each other, but participating in a fully balanced approach to both wandering a graveyard at night and then also showing up to do the healing the next day. I think it balances the story. So, St. Cyprian is one of my main teachers, and I'm eternally grateful for that. And I also highly recommend St. Martha for people if you really want to get your life straight.
Yes, well, there's a lot of wonderful things to pull on with that, and I think that maybe another time we can have a conversation where we talk more in depth about all of that, because we could go for another hour talking about all of that. I think that the last question that I want to ask you, it's related to the question that I asked before, which is kind of what are you being drawn to, or what do you recommend? But is there any other advice besides, the body work? Are there any other things that you would want to advise people who are just getting into these practices, or who feel that they're being, drawn to do more divination, or drawn into this life a little bit more? What is a piece of advice that you wish you would have been given when you were a little earlier on in this process?
This is the one I was given. It's just the one I ignored, like everybody else does, which is
yes.
Do the dream work. Get your dream journal. Like, don't skip it. Make it a part of your everyday. I actually have an entry from this morning I need to write up, and I'm going to try to make sure I get done before I get to bed. I took notes this, literally roll out of bed, take your notes, and then write it up. And there's a couple things with that I want to encourage people with, which is sometimes you get this idea that like, oh, my dreams aren't as interesting, or I don't know what this means, or, it can be frustrating in some ways. I didn't have a dream. The dream doesn't end until you are done writing it up. It may not end there either, but as you write, the things that occur to you while you're writing are part of your dreaming process. So, you may be writing something about a place you visit in your dreams, like, oh, it's a forest. And then as you write, you're like, were there giant pine cones? Don't worry about it. If you feel there ought to be giant pine cones in this write-up, put the giant pine cones in the write-up. It's a continually creative process. And so do that. And then the journey work, honestly, I think a lot of people just get the cards and they think they can just start throwing down and that's it. And they get frustrated. Like, take the time to visualize in the same way as you would a dream, like literally walk through the cards and sit with the figures and ask them to talk to you. And it will work. I don't know what it will tell you. It's going to tell you something that it told differently than it told me within a certain limit. But that's how you build a practice. And when I finally did sit down and do the dream journal faithfully, like, that changed everything for me.
Yeah, I could not agree more on that. And dream work is, yeah. The ancients considered it so important for a reason, and we all need to do more. No matter how much we've been doing, there's always more we can pull on, which is just wonderful. So, yeah.
If you want to talk to the spirits, that's where they are.
Yeah. That's where they can most easily talk to us.
They're certainly everywhere else too. Very annoyingly.
Yeah. But annoyingly, but it is easier for them at those liminal points. So thank you so much, Brian. This has been just really the best conversation. And like I said, we could have talked for another hour, I'm sure, but I want to, This is just the first, I'm sure. And I can't wait to see more of your poetry and more of what you're going to produce. And I'm going to have links to your site and all of the things that you're doing. Is there anything else that you want to tell people about how to reach you or what you're working on?
Sure. First off, thank you. This really was a lovely conversation, and I very much enjoyed it, and I hope it was fun for everybody. I had fun. You can find me at wilkinsbrian.com. That's where I have reading services and poetry available. I have some upcoming projects I hope will be manifesting over the next 6 months or so, but they're very much in process, so I don't want to say too much about them right now. But I'm hoping to have some new work for people soon. So just, and you can also follow me on Twitter. I'm on Twitter too much. So
I think we all are right now.
I know.
I'm more than I usually am, which is odd for me, but
I actually have cut down, which when you see how much I'm on there is shameful, but, I do like talking to people there. I like engaging with ideas, and, there's a great community of magically inclined people who are willing to. Just the other day, I needed to research something, and I put out a call to see if somebody had a book I didn't have, and they let me know, and, it's all set. So you can find me there. I'm happy to talk to you, and feel free.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you, Brian. And thank you everyone who joined us live. And thank you for everyone submitting your questions. They're always so wonderful. So thank you all. Good night.
Thanks a lot. Good night, folks.
A really lovely discussion with Brian, who is an excellent diviner and magician, and there was obviously so much more we could have gone into regarding work with saints and all things tarot and geomancy. I highly recommend checking out Brian's website, which is included in the show notes, if you're interested in getting a reading from him or finding out more about his work. I've also linked to the book that was mentioned regarding intention magic, which is The Power of 8 by Lynne McTaggart. As always, thank you for listening. Thank you to everyone who joined in live and submitted questions via the webinar. We do that almost every time. Actually, the next Coffee and Divination will be a swapcast, and therefore we will not have a live audience for it. But the ones after that certainly will, as usual. Please subscribe to the podcast, leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts if you enjoy what we're doing here, and check out our website at coffeeanddivination.com. You can also find me on Twitter, where I am at FiddleAngel. Enjoy your journeys with divination, and I will see you next time.
This way.